You might think that the surprise election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Congress would have been met with a bit of enthusiasm among in at least one quarter of the House of Representatives, and that's the Congressional Progressive Caucus. This is a coalition of the most progressive members of the Democratic caucus who are trying to advance legislation as far as they possibly can. In fact, I've been talking privately with a bunch of different members of the CPC, and the reaction has not been, okay, there's energy with us now, Ocasio-Cortez shows that we're in the ascendance. I might not be a democratic socialist, but I kind of agree with most of what she's saying. Now is our opportunity to roll on the agenda that we've been advocating for our entire careers. But that has not been the reaction. The reaction that I've gotten instead has been, ugh, is she going to endorse a primary challenger against me? It's quite a palpable fear that you see from a lot of these members of Congress that they don't quite understand what's going on in the country out there, and they feel like the election of Ocasio-Cortez is saying that they've been doing it wrong. That they're not getting the respect that they feel like they deserve for the service that they've put in over the years, for the work that they have done over the years. That gives Ocasio-Cortez an extraordinary amount of power when she comes into Congress, and could also be a minefield. So you have the situation where there are going to be a lot of members of Congress in both parties, not just the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party, looking for her to slip up, looking for a way to say, okay, actually, we're on the right track. We're fine. We don't have to rethink everything that we've done. In that context, some comments that she made on Jacobin's podcast, The Dig, are particularly relevant.
The right has really successfully used groups like the House Freedom Caucus to push their agenda. Do you think that the Progressive Caucus, which has been much lower profile for a long time, but has a significant and growing size, can do the same for the left?
I mean, I think there's potential. It all depends on how unified that caucus is. The thing that gives the Freedom Caucus power is not their size, but it's their cohesion. And right now, the Progressive Caucus is a little like, it's bigger than the Freedom Caucus, actually. I think it's like 70 or 80 people. I think the Freedom Caucus might be a bit smaller, but I could be mistaken. And but the thing is like sometimes they vote together, sometimes they don't. A lot of it is just being in the caucus is important. But
to signal to your voters, like let's say you're my congressman, David Cicilline, to signal that you're a progressive.
Exactly. So some people use that as a signal, but the thing that gives the caucus power is that you can operate as a block vote in order to get things done. And the question is how willing even if you can carve out a sub-portion, a sub-caucus of the Progressive Caucus, even if you could carve out that, even a smaller block, but one that operates as a block, then you can generate real power.
The problem with the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and she said it very diplomatically, that they've done a lot of good work, they stand for good things, is that it too often acts as just signaling. I joined the Progressive Caucus in order to show voters in my district that I am progressive. And so it just becomes kind of this self-fulfilling thing. Why am I progressive? Well, because I'm in the Progressive Caucus. It's, I must be progressive. That's proof that I'm there. And then that takes some of the responsibility for actually enacting a progressive agenda away from the Progressive Caucus. The other problem that they have is in some ways a good problem to have. They're too big. There's something like 78 members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and a 78-member caucus is very difficult to move as a block. If you get a letter that has 78 members signing it saying, we will not vote for X unless you do Y, Democratic leadership can pretty convincingly tell itself, these 78 people are not all going to stick to that. We're going to be able to split them up. And so Ocasio-Cortez's analysis and her argument is there should be a subgroup, a subportion, a sub-caucus within the Progressive Caucus of more hardline members who are willing to say, no, we're voting as a bloc, and unless you do what's right, we're not going to give you our votes. And if Democrats take the majority by 5 or 10 seats, and you have a dozen members of this sub-caucus or whatever you want to call it who do hold the line, then in fact they would have an extraordinary amount of power, and the Democratic leadership would have to deal with them. That wouldn't necessarily be the case with Trump in office, because with Trump in office, he's not signing any progressive legislation anyway. But so we're talking more about a potential, Democratic administration in 2021. But 2019 is going to be kind of a practice run for that, and there are still going to be important things that would go on the House floor. Now the question becomes: would even those 12 hold the line, and are there even 12 members who would sign on to something like that? And in my kind of canvassing of the House, it would be tough. It would be tough to get that far. You can think of some usual suspects. So you've got somebody like Ocasio-Cortez. You've got somebody like Ro Khanna. You can imagine Pramila Jayapal would join something like that. You can imagine maybe Jamie Raskin, maybe even Mark Pocan, though he has very palpable leadership ambitions himself. Maybe somebody like Barbara Lee, though she also has leadership ambitions. So you very quickly kind of run through a list of people. You've got people coming in, like maybe Ilhan Omar who's running to replace Keith Ellison. You've got Rashida Tlaib, who's running to replace John Conyers. But now you're already dipping into the future freshman class to try to get even close to those 10 members. But then the question becomes, could those 10 members even hold the line? And does it matter? So let's take those one by one. Back in 2009, when the Congress was debating the Affordable Care Act, something like 62 members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus signed a letter saying that if there is not a robust public option in the final Affordable Care Act, we're not going to put our names on that legislation. Without these 60-plus members, there was going to be no ACA. So this was a serious threat. What they meant by robust public option was that it would be a public health care plan similar to Medicare that would pay Medicare plus 5. That was the terminology going around at the time. It would pay 5% higher rates than Medicare currently paid. As everybody out there knows, there is no public option in the final health in Obamacare, and Obamacare passed anyway. Those 62 members all caved, because when they're presented with a binary choice at the end, you can expand healthcare to 30 to 50 million people. You can expand Medicaid. You can do away with insurance companies being allowed to use pre-existing conditions to deny you coverage. You can, reduce the price of subsidies for coverage, etc. You put that in front of people compared to the current system, which a lot of people have forgotten how absolutely barbaric our system was before. That if you didn't have health insurance and you were diagnosed with cancer or something else, it could very much be a death sentence, even if it was not a fatal cancer diagnosis, because there was no way you were going to get insurance. That's not the case anymore. If you had cancer as a kid and you recovered from it, you were probably never going to be able to get covered for the rest of your life. That's not the case anymore. And so you put that question in front of a progressive, almost every time they're going to say, this is not everything I want, but I'm going to go ahead and vote for it anyway. But now to the question, does it matter? It turned out it did matter, because making the threat not credible as it was still got the attention at the time of the White House and Democratic leadership, and got the Progressive Caucus into negotiations that they had mostly been sidelined from. And as a result of that, they got some concessions. One of them was There was a provision put in there that said that a state could enact single payer legally, and it could use federal subsidies to do so if the legislature or the voters decided to do so. As a result of that, Vermont tried to do single payer. California is now, they failed. California is now talking about doing single payer. There's a bill being pushed in New York. All of that was enabled by a concession that the Progressive Caucus won as a result of that letter. And there were other concessions as well, money for this and that, and some tinkering around the edges. So it shows that it's not an easy win-loss. They didn't get the public option that they wanted, but by organizing and making that threat to make the bill better. Now, the fundamental difference here, people have been calling this, since I wrote about this recently, people have been calling it a liberal freedom caucus. The difference between what progressives are able to do and what conservatives are able to do comes down to both personality and politics. The people who make up the Freedom Caucus hate government. So if withholding their vote means that the government is going to shut down, that's not necessarily immediately a negative. They don't like federal workers. Federal workers don't show up. Okay, that's a win-win for them. Now, ultimately, it grinds things to a halt, and there's so much pressure that gets put on them that they eventually have in the past caved and opened the government back up. But fundamentally, they don't care about that. The Freedom Caucus is trying to roll back federal programs. They're trying to undo things, whereas the Progressive Caucus is trying to build things. And so if you're trying to destroy things, it's much easier to just say no and shut them down.